I never expected to find myself at the bottom of the world. As a marine biologist, I had spent most of my career in labs and on boats, safely above the ocean's surface. The Challenger Deep Lab, perched at the edge of the Mariana Trench, was supposed to be the pinnacle of my work. A place where the mysteries of the deep could be explored in a controlled, scientific environment. The station itself was designed to withstand the crushing pressures of the deepest part of the ocean. We were encased in a shell of reinforced steel and titanium, surrounded by layers of protective insulation. The station's walls were thick, but not thick enough to make us forget that outside, the water was as black as night and could crush us into nothing with a single breach. Despite our technology, we were intruders in a world that didn't belong to us. Dr. Tanner, you might want to see this. Dr. Carlos Alvarez interrupted my thoughts. He was huddled over his workstation, typing rapidly on the keyboard. I stood up and walked over, glancing at the screen. Alvarez was our bioacoustician, an expert in underwater sound analysis, and his enthusiasm was clear. He had been monitoring the trench for weeks, capturing the ambient sounds of the deep, mostly the groaning of tectonic plates and the occasional calls of deep-sea creatures. But now something was different. "What am I looking at, Carlos?" Alvarez's eyes rose to mine, his face brightened by the monitor's glow. "This," he said, pointing to a series of rhythmic spikes on the graph, "is not normal. I've been picking up these sounds for the past few days. At first, I thought it was just a new species of deep-sea life, maybe a giant squid or something we haven't catalogued yet. But the pattern, it's too consistent, too structured." I leaned in closer, studying the waveform. It was a repeating series of pulses, faint but distinct, occurring at irregular intervals. The longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to take on a shape, a pattern that was almost familiar, though I couldn't place it. My background in marine biology didn't include much training in sound analysis, but even I could see that this wasn't typical of natural marine phenomena. "What do you think it is?" I asked, keeping my skepticism in check. Alvarez had a reputation for getting overly enthusiastic about his discoveries, and I didn't want to jump to any conclusions without more evidence. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I've run the data through every filter we have, and it's not geological, it's not the hydrothermal vents, it's not tectonic activity, and it's definitely not any marine life I'm familiar with. I'm starting to think this might be something entirely different." I frowned, experiencing a tightness in my gut. The ocean was vast and largely unexplored, but the idea that we had stumbled upon something completely unknown was unsettling. Still, it was too early to make any assumptions. "Let's keep monitoring it," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Record everything, and we'll analyze it further. But don't get too ahead of yourself, Carlos. It could still turn out to be something mundane." Alvarez nodded, though I could tell he was itching to dive deeper into the mystery. As I turned to leave, he added, "Dr. Tanner, one more thing. I've been hearing something. It's faint, but if you listen closely, it almost sounds like..." "Like what?" He paused, as if searching for the right words. "Like speech. But not in any language I recognize. It's distorted, almost like it's being transmitted through water." I stared at him for a moment, trying to gauge whether he was serious. Alvarez wasn't the type to make things up, but the idea of an unknown source producing speech-like sounds deep in the ocean was absurd. "Run a linguistic analysis if you think it's necessary," I said finally, suppressing my doubts, "but let's not jump to conclusions." With that, I left the control room, my mind churning with possibilities I didn't want to entertain. I made my way through the narrow corridors of the station, passing by the ever-present signs of our precarious existence. The pressure gauges, the emergency protocols posted on every wall, the thick steel doors designed to seal off flooding. The deep sea had always been a place of mystery, but it had never felt threatening. Not like this. During the next few days, Alvarez continued his analysis, spending hours alone with his recordings, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Dr. Ian Marshall, our resident geologist, dismissed the sounds as nothing more than seismic activity, a byproduct of the trench's constant shifting. but even he couldn't completely explain the regularity of the pulses. Lieutenant Sam Bennett, our engineer, was more concerned with the station's integrity. He spent most of his time checking the systems, as if he expected something to go wrong at any moment. Then there was Jim Carter, our technician and communication expert. He was a wiry, nervous man, prone to pessimism, and the recent issues with our comms equipment hadn't helped his mood. The static that had started creeping into our communications with the surface was growing worse, and Jim was convinced it wasn't just a technical problem. "It's interference from the deep," he muttered one evening, as we sat in the mess hall over a hastily prepared meal. "This place, it's not like anywhere else. There's stuff down here we don't understand. Maybe we shouldn't be messing with it." I didn't respond, focused instead on the lukewarm soup in front of me. Jim's paranoia was nothing new, but this time it struck a chord. The station had always felt like a refuge, a controlled environment where we could study the deep without becoming part of it. But lately, it felt like the deep was pushing back. A few nights later, Alvarez came to me with new data. "Dr. Tanner, you need to hear this," he said, practically dragging me to his workstation. I had just finished my evening rounds, my mind already on the reports I needed to write, but his urgency was impossible to ignore. He played the recording, and as the sounds filled the small room, a sudden wave of fear overcame me. It wasn't just the rhythmic pulses anymore. There was something else layered beneath them, something that sounded disturbingly human. It was distorted, garbled, but there was no mistaking the cadence of speech. "What the hell is this?" "I don't know," Alvarez replied, his face pale in the dim light. "But it's getting clearer. Whatever it is, it's trying to communicate." Communicate? The word carried an undertone of danger. This wasn't possible. We were miles below the surface, surrounded by nothing but water and rock. There was no one down here to communicate with. "Listen to this part," Alvarez said, skipping ahead in the recording. The voice, or whatever it was, had changed. The distortion was still there, but the words were unmistakable. "Come deeper." The words sent a shiver through me. I had heard those exact words before, years ago when I was a child. My father, a deep-sea diver, had been lost on an expedition similar to this one. His last transmission before all contact was lost had been garbled, but I had always remembered those two words. "Come deeper." I stood there, frozen, as Alvarez replayed the clip. The same words over and over, each time more distinct and urgent. "What do you think it means?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could think about was my father's last transmission, and the terrifying possibility that whatever had taken him was now calling to me. I felt the crushing weight of the ocean above us, not just as a physical force, but as something alive, something ancient, watching us from the darkness. The deep had always been mysterious, but now it felt hostile, as if it were trying to lure us into its depths, where no light could reach and no one could find us. "We need to be careful," I said finally, my voice strained. "Very careful. I don't know what this is, but it's not something we should take lightly." Alvarez nodded, but I could see the obsession in his eyes. He wanted to go deeper, to find the source of the sounds, to understand. But all I felt was dread, a bone-deep certainty that we were about to uncover something we were never meant to find. Days turned into nights without much distinction at Challenger Deep Lab. The artificial lighting cycled through its programmed phases, but the monotony of our existence was varied only by the growing tension among the team. Alvarez's discovery had planted a seed of concern in all of us, though we each handled it differently. For Alvarez, it was a spark of obsession. For the rest of us, it was a creeping dread that something had shifted, something that we couldn't fully understand. Alvarez's conduct turned more unstable as he investigated the sound analysis further. He rarely left his workstation, surviving on caffeine and adrenaline, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. He was convinced that the sounds were a form of communication, possibly from a previously undiscovered intelligent species. I wanted to dismiss his theory as a product of sleep deprivation and overwork, but the recordings haunted me too. Every time I heard those distorted voices, a cold fear settled in my gut, a fear I couldn't rationalize away. One morning, Alvarez burst into the mess hall, where the rest of us were trying to enjoy a semblance of normalcy over breakfast. His appearance startled us. He looked even worse than usual, his hands shaking as he held up a tablet. "I've isolated the speech patterns," he announced, his voice a mix of triumph and mania. "You need to hear this." Lieutenant Bennett, who had been quietly eating, set down his fork with a heavy sigh. "Carlos, you look like hell. Have you even slept?" Alvarez ignored the question, thrusting the tablet toward me. "Just listen," he insisted. I took the tablet, reluctantly pressing play. The familiar sound waves scrolled across the screen, but this time they were clearer. The distortion was still there, but beneath it, I could make out the cadence of speech more distinctly. The words were garbled, but there was an undeniable rhythm to them, a pattern that suggested intent. I handed the tablet back to Alvarez. "What language is this?" Alvarez shook his head. "I've run it through every linguistic database we have. It's not any known language, but there's something else, I swear. It's like it's trying to learn how to speak our language. The patterns are becoming more like English." "That's impossible," Dr. Marshall muttered, his skepticism obvious. "You're suggesting that something down here is intelligent enough to learn our language just from listening to us. This isn't some sci-fi movie, Carlos." Alvarez's eyes flicked to Marshall, his frustration just below the surface. "I know how it sounds, Ian, but this is real. I've cross-referenced these patterns with the station's logs, and the more we interact with it, using sonar, or even just the station's noise, the more responsive it becomes. It's reacting to us." Jim Carter, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice carrying the same paranoia that had been building in all of us. "Maybe we should stop. We don't know the nature of this. What if it's dangerous?" Lieutenant Bennett nodded in agreement. "I've been saying this from the start. We're in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and now we're messing with something we don't understand. We should report this to the surface and let them decide how to proceed." I wanted to agree with them. Every instinct told me that we were on the edge of something terrifying, something that we couldn't handle. But the scientist in me couldn't turn away. We were so close to discovering something unprecedented, and the allure of that was hard to resist. "We can't just abandon this," I said, hating the words even as I spoke them. "We need more information. If this is what Carlos thinks it is, it could be the discovery of a lifetime. We'll be careful, but we can't stop now." Marshall sighed and pushed his chair back from the table, clearly unhappy with my decision. "I hope you're right, Marcus, but I have a bad feeling about this." Bennett said nothing, but the tension in his jaw was evident. He wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but he also knew when a situation was out of his control. And right now, we were all out of our depth. As the days passed, the rhythmic sounds continued, growing clearer and more frequent. Alvarez was convinced that whatever was producing them was trying to communicate with us, and he spent hours trying to decipher the meaning behind the garbled words. His obsession with the project had reached a fever pitch, and it was starting to affect the rest of us. Then came the first real sign of danger. It started with the pressure gauges. We'd grown accustomed to the constant noise of the station's systems, the background noise of our life at the bottom of the trench. But one evening the noise changed. Subtle at first, but enough to catch Bennett's attention. He was in the middle of his routine checks when he noticed the anomaly. "Marcus, come here," Bennett called out, clearly worried. I joined him at the control panel, where he pointed to the pressure gauges. The readings were fluctuating, not by much, but enough to be noticeable. Normally, the pressure outside the station remained constant, but now it seemed to be increasing in small, irregular bursts. "What's causing this?" I asked, my mind going through possible explanations. Bennett shook his head. Could be tectonic activity, but there haven't been any seismic events in the area recently. I checked. It's almost like something out there is putting pressure on the station deliberately. The idea was ludicrous, but I couldn't dismiss it. Could it be related to the sounds? Bennett's expression darkened. If it is, then we have a bigger problem than we thought. The fluctuations in pressure continued throughout the night, and by morning the station's systems were showing signs of strain. The lights dimmed and brightened more frequently, and the temperature controls were struggling to maintain a stable environment. Jim Carter reported increased static on all communication channels, making it even harder to stay in contact with the surface. We need to consider the possibility that something is interfering with our systems, Bennett said during our next briefing. This isn't normal. We're miles below the surface, and the station is built to withstand the pressure down here. These fluctuations shouldn't be happening. Marshall, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. What if it's the source of the sounds? What if it's trying to get to us? I could see the fear in Marshall's eyes, a reflection of what we were all feeling. The deep sea was supposed to be a place of scientific discovery, not a place where nightmares came to life. We need to find out what's causing this. We can't just sit here and wait for something to go wrong. Carlos, continue your analysis. Sam, keep monitoring the systems. And Jim, do everything you can to keep our communications open. We need to stay connected with the surface. Later that night, I found myself alone in the control room, staring at the monitors. The rhythmic sounds were still there, pulsing softly through the speakers. But now, there was something else. Something I hadn't noticed before. A whisper, almost indistinguishable from the background noise. I leaned in closer, my breath catching as the whisper became clearer. It was a voice, unmistakably human but distorted, as if it were being filtered through miles of water. Come deeper. The same words from before, but now spoken with an urgency that made my heart race. I knew that voice, though it had been years since I'd last heard it. My father's voice calling to me from the depths of the ocean, just as he had before he disappeared. I bolted upright, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't possible. My father was gone, lost to the ocean years ago. There was no way he could be here, no way his voice could be calling to me now. But the whisper continued. Come deeper. I backed away from the monitor. This was beyond anything I could explain, beyond anything I could rationalize. I was a scientist, trained to seek answers, to rely on data and evidence. But this... I stumbled out of the control room, my thoughts racing. I needed air, space to think. But there was no escape from the station's claustrophobic confines, no way to outrun the knowledge that something was terribly wrong. As I wandered the corridors, I realized that Alvarez was right. We had uncovered something ancient, something that shouldn't exist, and now it was reaching out to us, trying to pull us deeper into the abyss. But why? And what would happen if we answered its call? I didn't sleep much after hearing my father's voice. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image. Dark water, endless and suffocating, pressing in on all sides, and a shadow moving through it, too deep to see clearly. When I finally drifted off, the dreams were vivid and terrifying. I was back on the surface, standing at the edge of a dock, staring into the ocean. The water was calm, but beneath the surface, something massive and ancient was stirring. It called to me, using my father's voice, beckoning me to dive in and join it in the abyss. I woke up in a cold sweat. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, but then the noise of the station brought me back to reality. I was miles beneath the surface, in the deepest part of the ocean, trapped with my fears and the growing certainty that we had disturbed something that shouldn't be disturbed. The station felt different that morning. The usual energy was subdued, almost like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I found Alvarez in the monitoring station, staring at the screens with the same focus he had shown for the past few days. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands shaking slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. He looked like a man on the edge, teetering between genius and madness. "Carlos," I called out softly, not wanting to startle him. "You okay?" He didn't respond immediately, his attention focused on the screen. "It's getting clearer, Marcus," he finally said. "The sounds, the voices, they're becoming more coherent. I think it's trying to talk to us." I walked over to his workstation, glancing at the data he was analyzing. The sound waves were sharper now, the distortions less pronounced. Beneath the layers of noise, I could almost make out words. Garbled and fragmented, but definitely words. The language was still indecipherable, but the rhythm and cadence were unmistakably human. "It's learning," Alvarez continued, trembling with excitement and fear. "It's trying to communicate, but it doesn't fully understand how yet. The patterns are becoming more complex. I think it's using our own voices, our own thoughts to learn." The idea was horrifying, but I couldn't dismiss it. If this entity, whatever it was capable of mimicking human speech, then it was more intelligent than anything we had ever encountered in the deep. And if it was using our voices, I pushed the thought away, refusing to let it take root. "Have you shared this with the others?" Alvarez shook his head. "Not yet. I wanted to understand it better first. But Marcus, there's something else. I've been hearing things when I'm alone, whispers like someone's talking to me. But when I turn around, there's no one there. I thought it was just stress at first, but now I'm not so sure." My stomach tightened. I had heard those whispers too, though I hadn't admitted it to anyone. I could still hear my father's voice in my head, calling to me, telling me to come deeper. "We need to be careful, Carlos," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever this is, it's playing with us. It's trying to get into our heads, and we can't let it. We need to stay grounded, focus on the data." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was already too far gone, too obsessed with uncovering the mystery to heed any warnings. I knew I had to keep an eye on him, make sure he didn't do anything reckless. Before I could say more, the station's lights dimmed, plunging us into darkness for a brief, terrifying moment before the emergency lights kicked in. The red glow filled the room. The station groaned with the metal straining under pressure. "What the hell was that?" Alvarez asked, his voice tight with fear. "I don't know," I replied, trying to stay calm. We made our way to the control panel, where Lieutenant Bennett was already at work, his face lit by the harsh glow of the screens. He didn't look up as we approached, his focus entirely on the diagnostics. "Sam, what's going on?" I asked, trying to read the data over his shoulder. "Power fluctuation," he muttered. "The main generator's struggling to keep up with the load. The pressure outside is spiking again, and it's putting a strain on the systems. We've got backups, but if this keeps up..." He didn't finish the sentence, but it was obvious. If the main generator failed, we'd be cut off from everything. Power, oxygen, communication. We'd be trapped in the dark, miles below the surface, with no way out. "We need to stabilize the pressure," I said, trying to think of a solution. "Can we reduce the load on the generator?" "I'm already doing that," Bennett replied. "But it's not enough. The pressure's coming from outside, and there's only so much we can do about that." A sudden thought struck me, and I turned to Alvarez. "Carlos, could the sounds be affecting the pressure? Is it possible that whatever's out there is causing these fluctuations?" "It's possible. The sounds are coming from deep within the trench, and they're intense. If they're resonating with the station's structure, I don't know, Marcus. This is all speculation." "But it's a theory," I pressed. "If the sounds are linked to the pressure, then maybe we can disrupt them, break the pattern somehow." Bennett looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "You're talking about using the sonar to send a counter-signal, right? But that could backfire. If we piss off whatever's out there..." "We're already in danger," I said. "We need to do something, or this station is going to collapse. I'd rather take a calculated risk than sit here and wait to die." Bennett clenched his jaw, then gave a curt nod. "I'll rig the sonar to send out a burst, but we need to be ready for whatever happens next." As Bennett worked on the sonar, Alvarez continued monitoring the sounds. The pressure fluctuations were getting worse, the station groaning under the strain. I could feel the weight of the ocean, the walls creaking as if they could give way at any moment. Finally, Bennett was ready. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, his finger poised above the button. "Everyone hold on." He pressed the button, and the sonar burst filled the trench with a thunderous noise. The sound was intense, causing the metal to vibrate. The pressure gauges spiked again, higher than before. "Shit!" Bennett cursed, trying to stabilize the systems. "It's getting worse!" Suddenly, the sounds that Alvarez had been monitoring changed. The rhythmic pulses became louder, more aggressive, as if whatever was out there was responding to our signal. The distorted voices intensified, overlapping in a chaotic jumble that filled the room. I could hear my father's voice again, clearer now, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. There were others, too. Voices I didn't recognize, all speaking at once, forming a chorus of madness. Alvarez shouted, his hands covering his ears in a futile attempt to block out the noise. Bennett, meanwhile, tried to shut down the sonar, but the system remained unresponsive, trapped in a feedback loop. The pressure outside the station continued to escalate, causing the walls to groan under the increasing strain. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The pressure gauges dropped back to normal. The lights stabilized, and the station fell into silence. We stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. "What the hell just happened?" Marshall asked as he entered the room, drawn by the commotion. "We tried to disrupt the sounds," I explained, still trying to process what had just occurred. "But it didn't work. If anything, it made things worse." Bennett was staring at the monitors. "I don't think we disrupted it," he said quietly. "I think we pissed it off." The station's emergency alarms activated, red lights flashing as a new alert appeared on the screen. "Hull breach detected, Sector 4. "This is bad," Bennett said, springing into action. "We've got a breach. We need to seal off that sector now or we're done for." I felt a surge of fear as I grasped the enormity of the situation. If the breach couldn't be contained, the entire station would flood, and we'd be crushed by the pressure in seconds. Bennett was already at the control panel, isolating the affected sector. The rest of us rushed to the emergency lockers, grabbing our pressure suits. We didn't have much time. The station's automated systems would only buy us a few minutes at most. We scrambled into our suits, the heavy fabric and thick glass helmets providing essential protection against the threat of imminent death. "Sector 4 is sealed," Bennett reported. "But the breach is spreading. We need to evacuate." There was no time to argue. We followed Bennett to the escape pods. The pods were our last hope, designed to shoot us to the surface in the event of a catastrophic failure. But the surface was miles above, and even if we made it, the ascent would be dangerous, too fast, and the pressure changes could be fatal. We reached the escape pod bay, but as Bennett began the launch sequence, something caught my eye on the monitor, something moving outside the station. There, in the darkness, was a shadow, enormous and shifting, as if the water around it was alive. It was too far to see clearly, but I could feel its presence, feel its eyes on us. Bennett was about to launch the pods when the lights disappeared again, and the station's power cut out completely, plunging us into darkness. The emergency lights kicked in, but they were dim, not quite enough to see clearly. The escape pod controls were dead, the launch sequence interrupted. "We're stuck," Bennett said. "The power's out, we're not going anywhere." I turned to Alvarez, who was staring at the monitors. "Carlos, can you hear me?" I asked, trying to break through his fear. He nodded slowly, his eyes unfocused. "It's here," he whispered. "It's inside the station." "What do you mean?" "The entity," Alvarez whispered. "It's not just outside. It's in the station, in our minds. It's been watching us, learning from us, and now it's here with us." We had been so focused on the sounds, on the possibility of communication, that we hadn't considered the real danger. That the entity wasn't just observing us, but actively manipulating us, using our own thoughts and fears against us. There was no escape. The entity was everywhere, in the water, in the station, in our minds. It had us trapped, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. I looked at my team, at the fear in their eyes, and knew that we were all thinking the same thing. This was the end. We had come too far, explored too deeply, and now we were paying the price. The station groaned again, the sound of metal bending and straining under the pressure. I heard the whispers again, closer this time and clearer than ever before. "Come deeper." It was the last thing I heard before the station's hull gave way, and the crushing weight of the ocean rushed in to claim us. The water rushed in, slamming into me with the force of a freight train. In the blink of an eye, the station's walls buckled, the metal screaming as the pressure outside crushed it like a tin can. I felt the floor give way beneath me, my body thrown against the bulkhead as the deep, dark water swallowed us whole. I couldn't see anything in the chaos, just blackness, absolute and suffocating. The emergency lights died as the station's power failed completely. All that was left was the sound of water filling every crevice, every corner, and the silence of the deep. For a moment I thought I was dead. My mind drifted into a strange, detached state. It was like I was floating, lost in an endless void, with no up or down, no direction, just the crushing weight of the ocean bearing down on me from all sides. But then, through the haze of my fading consciousness, I saw a glow in the distance, weakly discernible through the blackness. I tried to move, to swim toward the light, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. My mind screamed at me to fight, to resist, but it was no use. The light was pulling me in, drawing me deeper into the trench, deeper into the unknown. And then I heard the voices. Not just one, but many, all whispering in unison, their words an alien language that I couldn't understand. But the intent was clear. They were guiding me, leading me towards the source, toward the entity that had been haunting us from the moment we arrived. The words continued in my mind. The voice no longer just my father's, but a chorus of voices. Familiar and unfamiliar, human and inhuman, all converging into a single, powerful presence. I didn't know how long I drifted through the darkness, but the light became more intense, and with it came a terrible clarity. I knew now that I was no longer just Marcus Tanner, marine biologist. I was something connected to the entity that had lured us here. I could feel it now, inside my mind, sifting through my memories, my thoughts, my fears. It was ancient, far older than humanity, and it had been waiting, guiding us toward this moment for millennia. The trench, the station, even my father's expedition. They were all part of its design, a slow process of manipulation that had led us to this point. The light was almost blinding now, and as I drew closer, I could see shapes forming in the glow, massive alien structures rising from the ocean floor like the relics of a lost civilization. At the center of it all, the source of the light was the entity itself. It was vast, a mass of shifting energy. It wasn't a physical being, not in any sense that I could understand. It was more like a consciousness, a presence that extended beyond the confines of the material world. I felt its focus on me, and with it came a flood of memories, not just mine, but the memories of others who had come before me. I saw their faces, heard their voices, felt their terror as they too were drawn into the entity's grasp, their minds consumed and repurposed for its own unfathomable goals. The sounds we had heard were not just communication, they were a form of mental manipulation, a way for the entity to plant thoughts and ideas into our minds, to nudge us in the direction it wanted us to go. And now, it was my turn. The entity's presence filled my mind completely, pushing out all thoughts of resistance. I could feel it tearing through my memories, my emotions, dissecting them, analyzing them, and then discarding them as it absorbed everything that made me who I was. In those final moments, I had one last thought. This was not the end. The entity would continue as it always had, its influence spreading further and deeper into human history. And there was nothing I or anyone else could do to stop it. I tried to resist, to fight back, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. The entity was too powerful, too ancient, and I was just a speck in the vastness of its design. As the last vestiges of my consciousness began to dissolve, I saw a memory of my father, long before his ill-fated expedition, teaching me how to dive. He had always been fascinated by the ocean, by its mysteries, but there had been something else, something darker that he had never shared with me. I could see him now, standing on the shore, staring out at the horizon with a look of recognition, as if he had known even then what awaited him in the deep. As that memory of my father lingered in my mind, something in me broke. A tether snapped, and I let go. The recognition in his eyes, the acceptance of what awaited him, became mine. I stopped resisting, allowing the entity to consume me, my thoughts merging with the darkness, my consciousness dissolving into the vast, ancient void. In that final moment, I understood. We had always belonged to the deep. The surface team waited anxiously for news from the Challenger Deep Lab. Communication had been sporadic for days, filled with static and noises. But now, there was nothing. The station was silent. A rescue mission was dispatched, but when they reached the location of the station, all they found were scattered pieces of wreckage floating aimlessly in the deep. There was no sign of the station, no sign of the crew. The official report listed the Challenger Deep Lab and its team as lost, a tragic accident caused by the unpredictable nature of the deep ocean. But the truth was buried, hidden away in classified files, never to be spoken of again. But the ocean remembers. The trench remains deep and dark, its secrets hidden in the cold, crushing depths. And somewhere, far below, the entity waits, watching, learning, and planning. It is patient, it has time, and it knows that one day someone else will come, someone else will hear the call. And when they do, the entity will be ready.